All right, so anyway, today we've now made it till middle of 1942. We're slowly getting there. Uh, and we're talking about one of the, perhaps I think, one of the most interesting battles and actually series of battles that occurred in the war in the Pacific. The Battle of Guadalcanal and the Solomon Islands is an extremely extensive battle. It goes on for quite some time. In fact, Guadalcanal itself goes on for 6 months. So it is, I think, probably again, I think it's the most interesting battle, actually, of the entire Pacific War. So with that said, let's get started. And we'll talk about the Japanese conquest of 1942. Again, by that time, by June, they had indeed captured everything they expected to get. So they have the entire southern resource area here. And the problem with that is, though, like we discussed, is they didn't capture anything that would produce things. They captured natural resources. So consequently, everything has to be shipped back to Japan via sea, processed there, and then sent back out to war. The other key thing is that Japan has been at war with China since 1937. So their economy has been running on a war footing. So in other words, everything they can possibly produce for war goods has been done for years. So their economy is running very, very hot as it can possibly run. Our economy, on the other hand, in 1941 is 6 times larger than theirs, and we haven't even begun to do what we can do. In fact, our economy grows by another 50% by the end of the war. So we can see that we have a much, much larger economy, and consequently what happens to the Japanese is they cannot afford a war of attrition. If they have a war of attrition, they can't possibly win. Their goal has always been to find a way to get what they want and then to have a negotiated settlement. Well, that doesn't quite work out. So, remember we talked about Phase 2, and what they had done at the Battle of Coral Sea was they had captured Tulagi in the Solomon Islands. Their plan from there, aside from the problem with Midway, was they were then going to expand to take Fiji and Samoa. So no one really wanted to fight in this area, like I talked about last week. No one really was structured to fight in this area. But indeed, because of the air bases and because of the desire to cut off the supply line to Australia, the Japanese, in fact, decided to continue to expand their defensive perimeter, which is actually not a good thing for them. They really don't have the resources to expand. So let's look at the Solomon Islands. And you can see from this that from 1942, actually August 7th of 1942 till November of 1943, in this little tiny area, there were 15 major sea battles. And particularly right here by the island of Guadalcanal, you can see that right between Guadalcanal and Tulagi, there were 5 major sea battles, plus 2 carrier battles that would have been over east of it. So there's a tremendous amount of fighting going on in this area for a significantly long time. Remember also that the Japanese main base is at Rabaul. They are building a base, an airfield on Guadalcanal. And this is 600 miles away. So this is the absolute maximum range for the Japanese Zero for it in order to escort bombers to this area. And in order to escort bombers in this area, they have to fly in a straight line. So they have to fly, for example, over Bougainville. This becomes important later. And then keep in mind that this piece right here is known as the slot. So when I refer to the slot, you will know that that's the space between those islands. Okay, we have plans after Midway as well. And simple enough, we have been still breaking Japanese codes, but the Japanese have changed it quite a bit, and so it's a bit more difficult for us to read those codes. But we still have ascertained that there is a buildup of forces going on at Rabaul. And consequently, we interpret that the Japanese indeed are going to continue to expand further to isolate Australia. There's a lot of proposals, primarily by Admiral King in Washington. Remember, he is the head of the U.S. Navy. He wants to raid Tulagi. MacArthur wants to invade Rabaul. I'm not sure where he thought he was going to get the power to do that, as we will see. But he wanted to invade Rabaul. And what they do is they come up with a three-stage plan. The first plan is to capture Tulagi and Guadalcanal. The second phase is to advance further up the Solomons and along the coast of New Guinea, a little bit of what we talked about last week. And the third phase is then to invade Rabaul. Well, Gormley, who's just come on in the South Pacific area, he's the new commander there. He's just got there. And he meets with MacArthur right away, and they come up with the plan. The fact is, you know, well, we don't even have the strength right now to do even phase one, which is to invade Tulagi and Guadalcanal and hold it. Well, Admiral King really says, you know what, I really don't care what you guys think. You're going to do what I want because I'm in charge of the Navy, even though he's not in charge of MacArthur. And he says, you're going to invade these islands. Well, and here's why. With the destruction of Quito Butai and the newly created 1st Marine Division, the Marines were never in a division form previous to this. Even in World War I, they never fought as a division. And King wants to get his licks in, if you want to put it that way, in before the Japanese have time to reorganize after the defeat at Midway. Right now, the forces are relatively equal. The Japanese have Carrier Division 5, as you may remember. That's the excellent fleet carriers Shokaku and Zuyukaku. They also have several light carriers and some converted ships. In fact, 2 of those are actually previously were ocean liners. And they are converted to carriers. The U.S. also, they have very strong land-based force, too, at Rabaul, very strong. And the U.S. has 4 fleet carriers available. They have Enterprise, Hornet, Saratoga, and Wasp. And MacArthur has a significant amount of air power of the AAF, the American Air Force, or Army Air Force. And he also has the Royal Australian Air Force, has some significant assets as well. And that's at Port Moresby. So Admiral King throws this minimum force together because he can do that because he has control of the 1st Marine Division, not MacArthur. And he says, you know what, we're going to invade, and we're going to invade August 1st. Gormley really hasn't got much to say about it because he is subordinate, obviously, to King. But they do get MacArthur to commit that he will be able to suppress Japanese air power on Rabaul. Unfortunately, MacArthur cannot do that. He does not have the assets, and he's not capable of doing that. But he agrees to this anyway. And then the commanders on the scene, particularly Vandergrift, who's in charge of the Marines, and Fletcher, who's in charge of our carrier force, they're going to do the best they can with what they've got to work with. But they actually refer to this operation as Operation Shoestring because they're so stressed for resources and so stressed for time that they don't really know how they're going to get this thing to work. And the biggest reason for that is that we are also committed to a major invasion in North Africa that fall. So consequently, the U.S. doesn't have assets to really do both things well. But King forces the issue. So again, he has one division that's his, and he's going to use it. So let's look at the command structure because this is critical into this battle. If you look at here, we can see this is the South Pacific area, and here's the dividing line between the Southwest Pacific area. The Southwest Pacific area is under MacArthur, and the South Pacific area is under Gormley, who reports to Nimitz, who reports to King. So Gormley is more of a minor player, actually, in this aspect. But he is in charge of that area. And what they have to do, because of where the dividing line is they actually have to move the line a little bit because Guadalcanal falls into MacArthur's area. Now, MacArthur thinks that he should be in charge of the entire Pacific. Unfortunately, the Navy says, no, you're not going to be in charge of the entire Pacific because these are our ships, and guess what? We're not giving them to you. But this will cause major issues, not just here, but down the road as well in the war in the Pacific. But again, keep this in mind. There is a dividing line, and that dividing line is right by Guadalcanal. So what are the Japanese plans? Well, like we said, they were planning on taking Fiji and Samoa. In June, after the debacle at Midway, they postpone it, and then July they say, well, you know, this isn't really probably a good idea right now, so we'll just kind of put it on the shelf. But as we talked about last week, the Japanese Army wants to take New Guinea, so they decide to do that overland attack over the Owen Stanley mountain range, and so they need supplies and support from the Navy to do that. Well, the Japanese also need, after Midway, to begin to reorganize their fleets because they've taken significant losses. And they create this little fleet in the South Pacific area, and it's called the Outer South Seas Force. It's composed of some elderly large heavy cruisers. It's composed of a couple of destroyer divisions and I believe 5 submarines, yes. But they also have one key asset. They have the 11th Air Fleet. And the 11th Air Fleet is a fantastic unit and consists of some of the greatest pilots in Japan. In fact, many of their top aces were in this unit. So this is a very, very, very strong Air Force. Well, Admiral King is pressing for this attack. He wants this done. He finds out that they're building an air base on Guadalcanal. When he finds out they're building an air base on Guadalcanal, he wants this thing to really go forward. And Gormley, like I said, has just gotten here. And he's kind of overwhelmed, I think is probably the best way to put it. He's struggling with trying to get, he was in Britain actually, and then they flew him back to the States for a week, and then they flew him straight out to his base out in the South Pacific. So he's really not had time to adjust and never really does properly adjust to this whole area or the situation. And he decides that there's going to be a meeting between his commanders for this invasion, but he doesn't attend. So the command invasion falls in 3 pieces. Fletcher, who I'm pictured here, is in charge of our carriers. Turner is in charge of the invasion fleet. And as I mentioned, Vandegrift is in charge of the Marines. Fletcher says, hey, you know, I'll be able to support this landing for 3 days. That's all I can do, because if I stay here longer than 3 days, I put my carriers at risk from Japanese airfields at Rabaul, and also the Japanese will then have time to get submarines in place, and that puts me at risk for losing carriers to submarines. And one thing he knows he cannot do is lose a carrier unless he's fighting other Japanese assets, carriers primarily. So by attacking a land-based target, he puts his carriers at risk, which is against his orders from Nimitz. That's his boss as well. So realistically, he's under pressure from 2 sides. One side wants him to stay there and protect the transports and protect the invasion fleet, but he's under orders not to lose a carrier, and fighting a land-based situation, he really can't do that. Well, Turner and Vandegrift are furious. Actually, there's reports on this that they were nearly coming to blows with Fletcher at this meeting. It was supposed to be a very, very contentious situation. And Fletcher really has been pessimistic about the whole operation. He didn't really think this was a good idea in the first place. So he's not backing down a bit. So the fact that Gormley refused to show up at this meeting and give overall direction to his 3 subordinates is really, really a big issue. He really should have gone there and told them what his expectations were, but he doesn't do that. Well, here's a picture. This is interesting. This is actually the Japanese airfield at Guadalcanal before the invasion. Yes?
What was his reason for not attending?
He was too busy because he had just gotten into the theater and was trying to organize his forces. The question was, why did he not attend? So everybody knows what I'm, because nobody can hear you. So yes, the reason he didn't attend was he felt that he He had just got there, and he was just too busy and too wound up doing what needed to get done to get his new staff and things in place. A critical error. But anyway, so originally we weren't even going to invade Guadalcanal until they saw that there was an air base going up, and that changes the ideas as well. That changes the plan for this invasion. So again, this thing is a rush job, and now in the middle of the rush job, they make another change. So, but you can actually see the original airstrip here at Guadalcanal before we invaded. And then in less than 2 months, the invasion force had to be gathered, it had to be organized, but a problem was that the ships that were coming from the United States to support this invasion with the 1st Marine Division were not combat loaded. When you combat load a ship, what you do is you put things that you need on the beach or on that invasion at the top, so it comes out in the order you need it. When you load a ship, to load it, just to transport things, you load it in the most efficient possible manner, so it will carry as much goods as possible. So what happens is they get this stuff, and everything's got to be taken off the ships and put back on the ships in the proper order. So that takes time too. And Turner requests a delay, and King gives him a total of 7 days. That's it. So we're going to do this, and too bad. So, and by the way, the dock workers in Australia were very, very uncooperative, I guess would be the way to use it. So the Marines end up loading most of this stuff themselves. Well, they send a 75-ship invasion force. Remember, most of or a good percentage of those ships are transports. That's not all 75 warships. And they hold a dress rehearsal at Fiji, and the thing is a disaster. I mean, the dress rehearsal just goes terrible. So they're like, oh man, this thing isn't going well. But they get a huge break. Remember that Tulagi is primarily a reconnaissance base. It's not really a base. It's got seaplanes. It doesn't have an airstrip. But it's used for recon. Well, unfortunately for the Japanese, the weather is really bad. And the entire U.S. convoy of 75 ships shows up off Guadalcanal on the morning of August 7th, and the Japanese are completely surprised. Like, where do these ships come from? So there's 2 forces here. One is going to Yoke, is going to Tulagi. X-Ray is going to Lunga Point in Guadalcanal. Fletcher launches a very successful airstrike and destroys all the float planes that are in the little harbor at Tulagi. And the Japanese basically wake up to like cruisers and destroyers shelling them. So it's quite a shock. 3,000 Marines land on Tulagi. The forces on Tulagi, the Japanese forces, like we discussed, refuse to surrender, and they fight to the death, basically. Some of them do escape onto Florida Island, but again, because of the terrain, remember, this is just like New Guinea. It's a terrible tropical triple canopy rainforest. It rains 200 inches a year. It's malarial. It's just a miserable place, and people just starve and die. That's really what happens to most of these Japanese that escape. The invasion of Guadalcanal, by the other hand, with 11,000 guys, the Japanese are mostly construction workers, a lot of Koreans there as well, and they don't defend the island at all. They basically run away and run into the woods. They also do something that is unfortunate for the Japanese as far as this battle goes, is they do not destroy their equipment and they do not destroy their food. They just abandon it. For example, they left the U.S. a small bulldozer. That will help them make the field. They left a small train. They left months of supply of rice and a lot of Japanese beer as well, and some sake, which the Marines enjoyed. So the Marines are really going to benefit from their generosity shortly, because what's going to happen is the Japanese are going to respond to this. And the response is going to come from Rabaul. First, they're going to launch airstrikes down the slot, and they are going to have a seaborne attack as well. But let's talk about the Air Force first. So over 2 days, really, the 7th and, well, mostly the and early into the 8th, the Japanese are only able to destroy one transport, and one destroyer is torpedoed, the Jarvis. And the Jarvis doesn't sink at this point. But what they do manage to do is they manage to vastly slow the unloading of those transports. And the other thing they do is the escorting Zeros shoot down 14 of Fletcher's Wildcats. Now keep this in mind. Fletcher has to maintain a combat air patrol over his carriers, and he has to also maintain a combat air patrol over Guadalcanal. There's only so many planes because you're using aircraft carriers. So when he's lost 14 planes, he's now very concerned that he can't do both. And if he can't do both, he wants to, like I said, he only wanted to be there 3 days. Now he's basically saying, I'm thinking about pulling out after 2 days. The Japanese surface force, like I mentioned, is hastily thrown together. It's 7 cruisers and 1 destroyer, hardly a balanced fleet, but the best they could muster. And their plan is going to run down through the slot. They're going to avoid Bougainville and come down and go right through the slot. Now, right here you see that is the dividing line between MacArthur and Gormley. So most of the time he's going to be in sailing, he's going to be in MacArthur's area. Well, MacArthur's Air Force spots the Japanese force, but misreports who they and what they are. They are reported not as 7 cruisers and a destroyer, but 2 seaplane tenders and 2 gunboats. Now, I know that seems like pretty wild, but again, think about this. These are Air Force pilots. They're not trained really to identify ships at sea. They really don't know what they're looking at. So consequently, they make a terrible decision because there's no way that the Allies think that a force of 2 gunboats and 2 seaplane tenders would possibly attack their fleet. Well, it's a problem, though, because now Fletcher, because of his loss of Wildcats, and he's getting also a little low on fuel, decides that he's going to tell Turner and Vandergrift that he's pulling out on the night of the 8th. So that's only 2 days. And they are like, whoa, this isn't good. And they call in Admiral Crutchley, and Crutchley is in command of basically the force that protects the anchorage. There are 2 invasion areas where all the transports are. And they call in Crutchley, and he's, going to have to come and talk to these guys. So Crutchley makes the decision to take the cruiser Australia, because he's a British admiral, but he's actually in the Australian Navy, kind of on Lend-Lease. And Crutchley takes the cruiser Australia to go to this meeting, takes it out of line, and leaves Captain Bodie of the cruiser Chicago in charge of the defense of the area. Unfortunately, that is a very poor choice. The Allies have placed 2 destroyers, one here, the Ralph Talbot, and the Blue, to be a radar picket. So basically to protect this entrance into the area. They have a southern force of Chicago, the cruiser Canberra, and 2 destroyers. And there is a northern force of 3 cruisers, Astoria, Quincy, and Vincennes, also with 2 destroyers. So realistically, they're in pretty good shape to take on 7 cruisers and a destroyer. They're very, very balanced as far as overall strength, it would seem. Unfortunately, the Allied forces are exhausted. They have been on total combat readiness for 48 hours, and they have decided to not stand down completely, but to lower their alert status to level 2. Mikawa has launched float planes, which is typical of Japanese tactics, to find the enemy, and also what they will do at night is they will drop flares to backlight them. So that's a very standard Japanese tactic. Somehow, and I have no idea how, the Blue and the Ralph Talbot completely failed to detect on radar or visually this Japanese force. The Japanese force sees them and makes a course alteration. Wrong button. So they make a course here. So they basically go around the blue. Now, how they got between those two, visually and on radar, is virtually amazing to me. But all I can say is the guys on those ships must have been awfully tired or derelict in their duty, because they should have been detected. Well, Mikawa slips past blue, and he attacks the southern cruiser force. And he hits the Chicago with a torpedo. They shell the Canberra terribly. The Canberra is basically a floating hulk when they're done with it. But what happens is Bodie doesn't send any warning to the northern force. In fact, he sails the cruiser Chicago this way, out of the battle. Again, total, no one knows really what happened, but it really is almost dereliction of duty. It's like he ran away, in effect. So the northern force observes flashes to the south. They interpret this as lightning because there's a storm cloud over there. They also are told by one of the destroyers that indeed there is a Japanese force or strange ships in the area. But they don't react quickly to it. And then Mikawa's cruisers fall on those three Allied cruisers, the Astoria, Vincennes, and Quincy, and they try to fire back, but then one of their captains says, no, 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 don't shoot. We're shooting at our own ships. Well, they're not. And then all three cruisers are quickly destroyed by that deadly Long Lance torpedo. So Mikawa is now faced with two choices. He can choose to try to regroup his forces and go after those transports, or because his original plan was to come in at night to avoid U.S. carriers, he can make the decision to retire. He makes the decision to retire because he's unaware that Fletcher has taken the carriers away. The possibility stands that had he indeed gone forward, he could have destroyed numerous of our transports. We don't know that. That's counterfactual history, which we're not going to talk about. But the fact of the matter is, it's another situation where the Japanese perhaps had an excellent chance to win this battle. Remember, they left supplies for the Marines and the ability to build an airbase. They also now have had a chance to destroy the transports with their cruiser force and do not do so. So the next day, Turner decides that he's going to take the transports and leaves because a good portion of his Fletcher's gone and a lot of his cruisers are sunk. Vandegrift literally begs him, do not do this. Yes? It is not that they did not, the question is, did the transports discharge their soldiers yet? It is not that they didn't discharge their soldiers, they did not discharge their supplies. So they don't have enough weapons and ammunition and food to stay on the island for an extended period of time. Yes, there's 11,000 on Guadalcanal and there's 3,000 on Tulagi. So, they agree to continue unloading until that evening, and that night he's going to pull out. Remember, he's still subject to Japanese air attacks. Turner orders that all ships that cannot sail be destroyed, so the HMAS Canberra is sunk by U.S. destroyers. You can see the picture here where their sailors are being taken off on the destroyers before the ship is sunk. Mikawa has inflicted the worst defeat on the United States Navy in history. To this day, the United States Navy has never suffered a worse defeat. 4 heavy cruisers are destroyed without loss to the Japanese. And the fleet, he's forced the invasion fleet to retire before they finish unloading. So now the Marines are in trouble because of the fact is they don't have a lot of ammunition, they don't have a lot of food. Fortunately, the Japanese left them a bunch. And they don't have the equipment to complete the airfield, but again, fortunately, the Japanese have left them the tools they need to do that. So, the 1st Marine Division, commonly referred to as the Old Breed. And who are these guys? Well, actually the bulk of them are volunteers that have come in right after Pearl Harbor. And they're armed with 1903 Springfield rifles. They do not have the M1 Garand. Remember, I always tell you the Marines always get the cast-offs. They've got World War I tin helmets, and they're kids. But they do have an advantage, and they're mixed with the real Old Breed, and this is what they've said about them. These were the professionals, the Old Breed. Many had fought Caicos in Haiti, Bandidos in Nicaragua, French, English, Italian, American soldiers and sailors in every bar in Shanghai. They were inveterate gamblers and accomplished scroungers who drank hair tonic in preference to PX beer, which they referred to as horse piss. Many dipped snuff, smoked rank cigars, and chewed tobacco. Cigarettes were for women and children. Okay? They were expert in every type of weapon. I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but there wasn't anything they weren't. They were tough, they knew they were good, and there were enough of them to leaven the division to impart to thousands of younger men a share of both the unique spirit and animated them and the skills they possessed. So they had this force of excellent, motivated troops that had combat experience, one of the only units in the U.S. that did, because they had fought in bush wars, basically. All right, so the Japanese army begins to rush troops into Guadalcanal. Their recon fails them, as our recon has failed us. And they only think there's 2,000 Marines on the island because they think most of them have left when the transports left. Unfortunately, there happen to be 11,000 Marines on the island. So they're a little bit confused. The Ichiki Regiment, 1st Element, by the way, the Ichiki Regiment was the regiment that was going to attack Midway Island. These were the guys that were going to land on Midway and capture it. So they send the 1st Element in. It's only 917 men, and they're delivered by destroyers, so they're lightly armed and lightly equipped, 20 miles, so that'd be this way, over here, from Henderson Field and where the Marines are. So they're going to, Ichiki, who that's actually his name, is so confident that he orders a frontal attack that night, the next day, actually, next evening, and says, you know, we're going to just attack the Marines. And by the way, this is called the Battle of the Tenaroo. It does not take place on the Tenaroo River. It takes place on a place called Alligator Creek. It's actually a misnamed battle. But regardless, so they rush through, and this right here is where the battle is going to take place. This is Alligator Creek. So they rush through, and they are incredibly repulsed by the Marines. Well, then what the Marines do is they launch the next morning. They sweep around behind them. And now the Japanese are trapped in this circle, and they just crush them. And they bring in light tanks and literally just grind them up. But the fact of the matter is the Japanese won't surrender. So this is the first time the Marines have now encountered what we talked about last week, the Japanese cult of death. So it's an incredible massacre, but the Japanese won't surrender. And this is just a shock to the Marines, and it tends to dehumanize the Japanese forces in their eyes. And Vandergrift says, I have never heard of or read of this kind of fighting. These people refuse to surrender. The wounded wait until men come up to examine them and blow themselves and the other fellow to pieces with a hand grenade. So this, again, is the part where the Japanese cult of death causes the war to become more and more violent. Okay, this is a cool picture. I wish I had blown this up more, but the fact of the matter is this is Henderson Field in August of '42. Those are bomb craters. And over here, you can just make out the U.S. planes on Henderson Field. Now, so on the 18th, the airfield finally is completed, and Marine squadrons are brought in. The field is named after Lofton Henderson, who died at the Battle of Midway, leading VMS B-241, which attacked the Hiryu, and the plane I mentioned, the Douglas Dauntless at Pensacola, was indeed in Lofton's squadron. So there's quite a good tie in there. The Japanese are now confronted with land-based fighters, dauntless dive bombers. They were already struggling, again, because they've got to fly 1,120 miles round trip just to get there to attack and then fly back, so that's 8 hours of time. And what happens also, too, is that when the U.S. planes are shot down, the pilots bail out, they're rescued. When a Japanese pilot is shot down, he's not rescued. So virtually every time a pilot is shot down, they're lost. And why don't we take a brief break and we'll talk about the Coast Guard. Let's get started again. Remember I told you earlier that when they were flying, they had to fly a direct line from Rabaul to Guadalcanal. Well, what would happen is the Australians came up with an idea to create a thing called Coast Watchers. And that was prior to the war. And they were basically to act as a reconnaissance force for the Australians in the Pacific. They were really only armed with radios. They weren't given like any major weapons. They might have some rifles and pistols, but nothing significant. And what they were to do is not to get involved in fighting, but to just lay low and report back to headquarters what was going on. And they were given commissions as troops or naval personnel, Royal Australian Navy. They were given commissions in hopes that when they would be captured, they would not be executed as spies. Unfortunately, they were executed as spies. Were they to be captured by the Japanese, they did not survive. Two Coast Watchers on Bougainville, named Reed and Mason, were credited by Halsey as saving Guadalcanal. So what would happen is these guys would be on Bougainville Island, and when the Japanese planes would fly over, they would radio to Guadalcanal and say, hey, there's a strike of Japanese aircraft coming over right now, and they would just figure out the time, so it was probably 2 hours or so. And then the U.S. Marine and Navy pilots would know that they needed to get in their planes, get up in the air, and climb as high as they could. So they would be above the Japanese when the Japanese came in, and they would be able to then attack them much more effectively. And this causes a tremendous amount of losses for Japanese aircraft. So these people had played a major role. They would also be able to, occasionally they would sight ships. Frequently the Japanese Navy would sail away from Bougainville, but we did have Coast Watchers on other islands as well. So these people were pretty important. And how important were they? It is a Coast Watcher that's responsible for saving John F. Kennedy. So Kennedy's shipwrecked on a little tiny island with a little reef around it, and some natives come up to the Coast Watcher here, Evans, and say, hey, we spotted some Allied guys over there. He goes out and checks it out and radios back, and that's why Kennedy is saved. Well, now we have the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, and really what's going on here, as we go through this class more, is the Japanese are doing everything they possibly can to take back Guadalcanal. They want that air base. They want it bad back. So what they do is they bring in Carrier Division 5, that's Shokaku and Zuikaku, their two best fleet carriers, and a light carrier Ryujo with 177 planes. That's the best they can scrape up. And the U.S. counters with Saratoga Enterprise. The Wasp has been sent back to refuel. So the Wasp is not available. So it's 2 against 3, but it's pretty equal because we also have Henderson Field. It's kind of like the Battle of Midway. So the U.S. scouts, they find the Ryujo and they sink it quickly. The Japanese launch 2 strikes from their group, and they score 3 bomb hits on Enterprise. But damage control, again, I can't tell you enough how much those Yorktown-class carriers were incredibly resilient to damage. And the Enterprise survives that. And the second strike is misinformed as to where the U.S. carriers are and misses them completely. So it's very possible that the Enterprise would have been sunk because the Enterprise was damaged and moving very slowly and would have been a relatively easy target, but is fortunate to have escaped by the fact that the Japanese reconnaissance had given them bad information. Well, when the Enterprise is damaged, instead of taking the planes back to be with the ship to Honolulu to be repaired, they take their flights and send them to Guadalcanal. This reinforces the island. So once again, there is now more planes on Henderson Field than there were before. Yes? Thank you. I took it myself. No. The question, if you didn't hear it, you said that's a great photo. And it is a great photo. I assume that's a clip from a movie. I assume. Yes? Yes, because we have control of in the daylight. So in the daylight, U.S. ships can come in and unload. Okay? So we have brought in, we've flown in airplanes from light carriers. Marines, actually, were brought in, not Navy. But now the Navy personnel is there as well, because when a carrier is damaged, we do this again with the Saratoga. When the Saratoga is damaged, its air group goes to Guadalcanal. When the Enterprise is damaged, its air group goes to Guadalcanal. So consequently, Guadalcanal is constantly being reinforced. Well, because the Japanese can't get their transport, well, I kind of skipped that. Let me go back here. The Japanese transports, or the Enterprise planes that next day, basically take care of the Japanese transports, sinking one, and they force all the others to retire. I need to get that in there. So what happens is the Japanese decide that they can't get transports in there at this time, so they decide what they're going to do is they're going to use destroyers to bring in troops at night. So the Japanese destroyers will come down the slot, drop troops off, and then zoom back up the slot at full speed to avoid U.S. air power. And they can make the time, because U.S. airplanes don't have a lot of range. They really only have about a 200-mile radius. So they can drop the ship, they can drop off the troops, and then run like hell to get away from the air power. And that's exactly what they do. And they get out, like I said, they get out of range. The U.S. names this the Tokyo Express, very famous. The Japanese refer to it as rat transport because rats come out at night. The problem with this, though, is very simple. They can drop off all the men they want, but they can't drop off any tanks, artillery, or heavy weapons, or even really enough supplies to support these troops, because that's a much more slower process than people jumping off a ship. So what they actually end up doing by the end of the battle is they start taking supplies and putting them in oil drums, roping them together, and dumping them off the side, hoping that they float in. This is not a particularly effective way to supply troops. And not only that, but remember, this is the same type of climate and area as New Guinea. This land kills. If you're not fed properly, if you don't get proper medication, you die. Well, the Japanese do manage to get 5,000 troops ashore, and they decide that they're going to launch an attack through the jungle. The U.S. can't really see this, but they know there's a weak spot in their line, and Vandegrift reaches out to the Raider Battalion that's on Tulagi, led by the legendary Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson. And Edson digs his men in on this ridge. Now again, this is nothing but jungle out here. But they can see that there's a possibility for a Japanese attack there, and that's what they do. The Japanese do sneak through the jungle, bring 3,000 of that 5,000 guys through that. But again, they're disorganized because it's hard to maintain command and control in the middle of a triple canopy rainforest. You can't see anything. So the Japanese don't coordinate their attacks, but they do nearly break through to Fighter 1. So they almost get one of the air bases. Well, Edson's reinforced, his guys fight brilliantly, and they manage to repulse the 3,000 Japanese that are attacking them. So it's pretty incredible battle, and one of the most famous in Marine history. Edson receives the Medal of Honor, and once again the Japanese must reinforce Guadalcanal because again they failed. This is the time when the Japanese made the decision to stop the assault on Port Moresby, like we talked about last week, on the Kokoda Trail. So the Japanese are stuck. They've got the MacArthur and the Australians in New Guinea, and they've got the U.S. Navy and the Marines in Guadalcanal, and they're stuck between a hard place. So they can't do both. So they make the decision to reinforce Guadalcanal and make the decision to stop the attack on Port Moresby. Remember, it was only 20 miles away from taking the town. Well, Japanese submarines get a very bad rap in this war. Because they don't function like U.S. submarines and German submarines by attacking easy targets, which are transports and cargo ships. The Japanese always try to attack capital ships, in other words, battleships or aircraft carriers. That's always their goal, because again, their main idea of the war was that the U.S. fleet would slowly come across the Central Pacific and they would whittle it down and make it doable for the Japanese fleet to destroy it. So they consequently have never really focused on attacking cargo ships, which they should have, but they didn't. But surprisingly, the Japanese submarines have been relatively effective. Remember, at Midway, the Yorktown is destroyed by a submarine, not Japanese air power. The Saratoga is hit right after Pearl Harbor on its way to Pearl Harbor, and now is hit again on August 31st. So the Saratoga is not sunk, but it is damaged. And so it's forced to withdraw. Well, then on September 15th, the I-19 fires what I believe is the single greatest torpedo attack in military history. The sub fired 6 torpedoes. 3 of them hit the aircraft carrier Wasp, destroying it. 1 hit the destroyer O'Brien. The O'Brien later sinks. And 1 hits the battleship North Carolina, which is now forced to return. I believe it went back to San Diego for the damage that it received from that torpedo. Remember, those Japanese torpedoes are very powerful. So it is an amazing amount of destruction caused by that 1 torpedo spread. But what happens now is the U.S. really, at this particular time, in this little window, has only 1 carrier in the entire Pacific. The Japanese, again, are committed to destroying Henderson Field. They decide to send out another convoy of fast transports, and they're going to be supported by a bombardment of the airfield by 2 Japanese battleships. So the Japanese are going to speed in at night, again, when their U.S. forces are grounded. They're going to shell the field, and then they're going to, if they don't destroy the field, they're going to scoot back out before U.S. power can get at them, or airplanes can get at them. Again, they think there's no carriers. It's really well planned because the Japanese, and they're the only people I think that would ever do this, is they have decided to make a 14-inch anti-aircraft shell. Now, it's a highly unusual thing to try to do, is to use a giant cannon that fires basically 2,000-pound shells, to use that thing as an anti-aircraft piece because, quite honestly, it fires so slowly. It probably fires 2 rounds a minute per gun. So it's a very odd weapon. But it has an advantage for this piece because what it does is it shoots out in the air and it's timed, and then it blows up and it scatters incendiary fragments hoping to hit an airplane. That's how it works. Well, this same type of weapon, you could fire it over an airfield, have it blow up over the airfield and scatter incendiary pieces all over the airfield. So it's actually a rather effective idea to use it against a soft target. They also fire a total of 973 14-inch shells. Now the Marines on the island are stunned by this. They can't believe, they're just terrified, realistically. But if you think about it, later in the war when we bombarded an island, we would spend 3 days with numerous battleships firing thousands of shells on the Japanese. So when you read about the mental effect of this bombardment on our Marine Corps, you have to then put that into the context of how the Japanese must have felt when we would basically surround an island with battleships and shell it for days. Well, the attack destroys almost all the aviation fuel on the island. There are only 7 SBDs that are available after the attack that are in flyable condition. All the TBFs, the torpedo bombers, the Avengers, are destroyed. So somehow the Marines managed to get the airfield back in operation by midday and begin to punish the Japanese transports. And the Japanese, because they can't control the airfield during the day, are forced to retire again before they finish unloading. So once again, the Japanese are thwarted in their ability to reinforce this island. Well, Gormley, like I had talked to you earlier in this presentation, he's really not doing a very good job. He's pretty disorganized. He's just not, he never goes to Guadalcanal to see what's going on. He never takes control of this battle. And consequently, Nimitz, and particularly the Marine Corps, has lost faith in him. They don't think that he's the right guy to be running this battle. And Halsey is appointed by Nimitz to take his place. And this is a huge, huge change. Because Halsey takes command on the 18th, and he brings Vandergrift in. Vandergrift flies into Halsey's headquarters where Gormley was. I can't think of the island. And he asks Vandergrift, he goes, can you hold? And he goes, yes, I can hold, but I need more support than I've been getting. And he goes, you go back there, Vandergrift. I promise to give you everything I have. And he does. Halsey is the most aggressive admiral we have, perhaps too aggressive at times, and makes an immediate difference. The morale changes, and again, he backs up his promise with action. And I really like this sign, and this basically says Halsey to me. Admiral Halsey says, kill Japs, kill Japs, kill more Japs. You will help kill the yellow bastards if you do your job well. This is the kind of, and also Halsey does go to the island and visits and talks to the troops. So he's not afraid to put himself on the line there as well. So it's a total shift in how the morale of the island goes. Well, the Japanese continue to try to get troops in using rat transport or the Tokyo Express, and they've brought their force up to 20,000. They believe there's only 10,000 Marines on the island, but unfortunately for them, there are 23,000, because remember, we can bring in troops during the day. So at daytime, we bring in troops and unload. At nighttime, they bring in troops and unload, but we're able to give us better supplies and because we just have more availability. We have much better logistics, even by this time. Japanese plan is to distract us by attacking here. That would hopefully draw forces this way, and then they are going to again attack through the jungle in the same area as Edson's Ridge, and the idea is to capture Henderson Field and Fighter 1. It's basically an identical plan, only this time they actually have enough forces to possibly achieve it. And second of all, they have a distraction plan. Well, this whole thing falls apart because the terrain causes terrible confusion. The attack is uncoordinated because, again, it's almost impossible to have command and control in the middle of a tropical rainforest. And it just doesn't work out. So 3 days of fighting, and that's primarily here, the Japanese only have 700 effectives left after out of 6,000. So basically they are totally defeated, again, in their effort to take over Henderson Field. No. They don't surrender. The only POWs we get at this time particularly is if somebody is unconscious and they drag him out. So now comes another carrier attack. On October 25th and 27th, the Japanese Army is trying to attack Henderson Field at this time. Same issue. It's all going on at one time here. And they're making a major bid to gain control. So they send a strong carrier force, the 2 fleet carriers, Shokaku and Zuyukaku, a light carrier, and those 2 converted ocean liners. which aren't very good. The Enterprise has been repaired already and has already been shipped back to the South Pacific with a new load of aircraft, and so basically it's the Hornet and the Enterprise against this kind of two good Japanese fleet carriers and this kind of ragtag bunch of carriers. But the Japanese are extremely limited by fuel. Again, they don't have the logistics to support major operations this far away from Japan for any extended period of time. And one of the ocean liners suffers a mechanical breakdown and has to withdraw to Truk, which is their major base further from Rabaul. That's where Rabaul doesn't have repair facilities. Truk does. So the Japanese launch perhaps their last great attack in the war. They score 5 bomb hits and 3 torpedoes and 2 suicide crashes into the Hornet. They also severely damage the Enterprise with 3 bombs. U.S. planes do manage to damage the Shokaku and the Zuhuyo. So the Japanese win a tactical victory, but they lose 97 of 199 planes. They lose 148 aircrew. Remember, that's way more than they lost at the Battle of Midway. The 102 aircraft that do survive are only 86 are flyable, and the Japanese make the decision to withdraw and make their carriers take no further part in this battle. And unlike the U.S. carriers that would take their planes and put them off at Guadalcanal, the Japanese do not take their planes and put them off at Rabaul. They take them back. And if you look at this picture, this is a pretty amazing photo. The lower circle is of a Japanese torpedo bomber. The upper circle is a Japanese Val dive bomber that's diving on the Hornet. And that plane is actually so badly damaged that after it releases its bomb, it crashes into the Hornet. So it's a pretty amazing photograph. Oh, and by the way, the Hornet does take 5 bombs and 3 torpedoes. It refuses to sink. It is actually sunk by Japanese destroyers that catch it later on as a floating hulk, and they sink it. So the question is, did the Japanese aircraft sink it, or did the Japanese destroyers sink it? That's one of those historical arguments. All right, the naval battle of Guadalcanal. Again, the Japanese are doing everything they possibly can to take this island. So they are going to send, again, a bombardment force to knock out Henderson Field. And again, it's going to be 2 battleships. And they're also bringing in 11, now this time, fast transports, because they're going to try to get in as quick as they can with 7,000 troops and large amounts of food and ammunition. So you can see here in this picture, the Japanese force is relatively spread out. And U.S. recon spots the force coming in, and Admiral Callahan, who was ordered by Halsey to launch an attack regardless, goes in with this force of cruisers and destroyers and runs in headlong at night into this Japanese force. It is literally, it's like a barroom brawl with the lights out. It's at point-blank range. A U.S. destroyer is so close to the battleship Hai that the battleship cannot depress its guns low enough to shoot at it. The battleship Hai is actually being shot at with machine guns at point-blank range from U.S. destroyers. It's an incredible battle. It's extremely confusing. Callahan and Admiral Scott are both killed, but they managed to stop the bombardment. And why did they stop it? Because Admiral Abe, who's on Hai, is wounded and disoriented. Even though he has a clear path for the battleship Kirishima to attack the air base, Henderson Field, he decides to withdraw. So once again, there's another chance the Japanese have to possibly take the island, and again they fail. And on the morning of the 13th, U.S. aircraft from Henderson Field and the ones from the Enterprise begin to attack the Japanese ship, and the Hai is actually sunk because it's badly damaged and can't escape U.S. air power. On the night of the 14th, the Imperial Japanese Navy cruiser force Yamamoto sends out to bombard Henderson Field. They're not particularly effective. And on the 14th, flyers from Henderson Field and the Enterprise again sink 7 of the 11 transports that the Japanese are trying to land. Yamamoto tries again with a 3rd bombardment on the 14th, the night of the 14th, and the Kirishima and a strong cruiser force, Tanaka is ordered to take the remaining 4 transports regardless and get them onto Guadalcanal. Yes? Yes. Yes, they are. They got 7,000 men aboard those ships. It's not a happy situation for anybody, believe me. So Halsey is aware of the approaching bombardment group and sends in the last thing he possibly has. This is the battleships that are escorting the USS Enterprise. This is the last force he has available in the South Pacific, and he sends them in under Admiral Willis Lee in order to stop the Japanese bombardment of the island. It is one of only 2 battleship engagements in the entire Pacific War. There's only 2 times in the Pacific War where battleships actually fight each other. And this is one of them, and it's a night engagement. So what happens is the Japanese force destroys 3 of Lee's destroyers. They severely damage the battleship South Dakota, but what the Kirishima doesn't know is while it's shelling the South Dakota, the Washington is coming in from a different direction. And the Washington catches the Kirishima flat-footed and sinks it. Tanaka orders that the 4 transports to beach. He knows he can't unload them in any other way. He literally sends them up onto the shore. And that day, planes from Henderson Field once again begin to bomb those transports and destroy the Japanese supplies. Also 2 U.S. destroyers, because they're free to roam in the daytime, come in and begin to shell those transports. And you can see in this picture here, that is one of the transports actually beached on Guadalcanal. So you can see over and over and over again, the Japanese are throwing everything they possibly have to take this island. And over and over and over again, they fail. Again, they cannot reinforce the island. And they have a name for the island now. They now call it Starvation Island. Because again, the Japanese are only really bringing in supplies with destroyers and throwing them literally off the side of the ships in barrels. And the Japanese troops are beginning to starve to death. It is really almost criminal the way the Japanese treated their men in this regard, because there's no way you should have put that many, 30,000 troops on an island without supplies, especially an island in this climate. So, as we said, they're literally starving. In the South Pacific, U.S. casualties just to malaria are 5 times what the Japanese inflict. So you have to imagine how many casualties the Japanese are suffering from malaria and scrub typhus and dengue fever, on and on and on. Yes, Bill? They are evacuated to the hospital. They're not dead. They're casual. They're sick. Some die, but malaria normally doesn't kill. It just debilitates you. So in January of '43, the Japanese decide to abandon the island. They've finally given up. And it's interesting, probably the best maneuver they made for the entire battle is they evacuate over the night, what is it, 3 nights, I believe. They evacuate with 20 destroyers, 10,650 men. And they leave on February 7th, 6 months to the day that the battle began. I want to show you this picture. Remember, this is a little area. This is only the difference between Guadalcanal and basically Tulagi and Florida Island. That is the total number of ships sunk on both sides in that little area. That's how it got the name Iron Bottom Sound, because it's full of sunken ships. All still down there. They're all deep. It's very deep water. I don't know exactly. I'd say it's probably in the neighborhood of 30 miles. Yes, sir. The airfield. They wanted to take the airfield so they could cut the supply line. The Japanese took Tulagi to cut the supply line to Australia. The U.S. is taking it back to reopen that supply line. So that's the strategic aspect of why they're in this terrible area. They really shouldn't be fighting here. Neither side wanted to fight in this area. But if you look at this, yes, yes there are. Yes, there are. But don't forget, more Japanese ships were also sunk by our carrier and planes further away, too. So this is just, I'm just showing this little tiny area. But yes, actually, U.S., I believe it's, I think there's like 20 Japanese ships in there and like 31 U.S. But some of a lot of U.S. ships are cargo ships as well. They're not all, like the APDs and the YPs and PT boats, you know, that's not major ships. Yes? Yes, most of the time they're simultaneously, particularly the last one. Those were designed to be done at the same time. Oh yes, it's a relatively large island. Yes? The Laffey, you mean? L-A-F-F-E-Y? I'm not quite sure if that would be the case. The Laffey was, I can't remember what battle off the top of my head what it was involved with. But it was actually renamed, and it was the most famous ship for the fact that off Okinawa, it took its successor, took 6 kamikaze hits and survived. And you can still see that ship today at Patriots Point in Charleston. Yes? Yes, the Canberra and Crutchley and the Cruiser Australia were there as well. Yes? Okay. Yeah, they could probably see some of the cargo ships, but actually it's surprisingly deep. I believe it's almost a mile of depth between those two islands because they're basically volcanic cones. They're probably the cargo ships that were sunk nearby. Like I showed on the picture of the sandbar. They were just massacred. But actually, like I said, some of this activity, Ballard, for example, did search for these ships, did see the Canberra, for example, the Australian ship that sunk. The Kirishima was found. There's numerous ships that have been found. Anyway, just to get the idea of how violent these naval battles were. So, the battle for Guadalcanal cost the Japanese about 30,000 men. 75% of those died from disease or lack of medical care or starvation. They lost about, basically over the total time of the battle, they lost about the same amount of ships as the U.S. did, and they lost approximately the same amount of planes. It's pretty close. But the fact of the matter is the U.S. can replace these losses, the Japanese cannot. So a war of attrition, like I talked about in the first minutes of this presentation, the Japanese cannot possibly win a war of attrition. The Japanese say this about Guadalcanal. Guadalcanal is no longer merely a name of an island in Japanese military history. It is the name of the graveyard of the Japanese army. The same can be said about the Japanese naval air arm. Guadalcanal is the graveyard of both. And Admiral King's big gamble pays off. He wins the battle, and he gets the support from Roosevelt to continue offensive operations in the Pacific. We'd have to ask, what would have happened if the 1st Marine Division had been destroyed? Would we have continued to make aggressive moves in the Pacific? Would we have continued to do any more than just try to hold Australia and then let the Navy do its thing? Would the government, the U.S. government, have supported the military, particularly infantry divisions? Many, many U.S. troops are brought into the Pacific. In fact, you know, everybody talks about Europe first. Until late in 1943, there were actually just as many men in the Pacific as there were in Europe. So consequently, had that 1st Marine Division been destroyed, certainly the Japanese would not have won the war, but it certainly would have changed how the war developed. Does anybody have any questions at this time? Yes?
I've read that because of Pearl Harbor, there was a lot of feeling among the American populace that it's Japan we need to focus on, whereas the civilian and military leadership had a different view and Europe first. Did that cause much discord in the country, politically and otherwise, or not?
I wouldn't say it caused a lot of discord in the country, but it certainly, for example, Admiral King really wanted to beat the Japanese. He really wasn't all that interested in Europe. He basically figured that the British Navy could handle that, and basically we should spend the bulk of our efforts destroying the Japanese. Because let's face it, the U.S. Navy was extremely angry about Pearl Harbor. So was the U.S. population. I mean, basically, well, look at Halsey. Kill Japs, kill Japs, kill more Japs. I mean, there's a lot of anger there, and the U.S. population is equally angry. They certainly wanted Japan, at the very least, punished. So, yes, there was some of that, but again, the civilian population, I don't think had a lot to say about it, at least from what I know. Yes, Bill? Yes. Yes, because not only those, okay, there's 7 SBDs, but there's also Wildcat fighters and Navy, Army, Air Force, what they referred to as P-400s. P-400 was the export version of the Bell P-39, which was an interesting fighter aircraft in the fact that the Bell P-39 was armed with a 37mm cannon firing through the nose, through the prop. So it relatively has some severe, so basically everything they had was out strafing those transports. It was impossible for the Japanese to do much with it because again, they're subject to U.S. air power. Yep, yes it does. I'm not sure how comfortable that was, but yeah, it's an interesting design to put a 37mm cannon on a fighter plane. But we did it. Anybody else today? All right, well, I guess that's it for me today, so thank you so much. Oh, you know what? Wait a second. I want to say one more thing, because I got a minute or two. Okay. The question that came up a long time ago, and I never answered it, and I've been trying to answer it. What is the difference between a battleship, a cruiser, and a destroyer? All right, make it simple. A battleship at this time generally was a ship of about 35,000 to 40,000 tons. It was armed with large cannon, basically 14 to 16 inch. The Japanese did have one with 18 inch, the Yamato and the Musashi, which was the largest in the world. But generally, they were 35 to 40,000 tons. They had 9 to 12 major cannon, and they were not particularly, they got faster later on, but early in the war they weren't relatively quick. And they were designed to be what they called a battle fleet. So that was what your battleships were for. Then cruisers were interesting. Originally, cruisers were to be the eyes of the fleet. The cruisers were about 10,000 tons. They were armed normally with 8-inch guns, which made them a heavy cruiser, or 6 or 5-inch guns, which made them a light cruiser. But generally, cruisers were really fast. They had a long range, and they didn't have a lot of armor. And they did two functions. The biggest function they had really was to be like to show the flag in various ports and maintain safety for your merchant fleet. For example, when we looked at the Philippines, the U.S. didn't have any battleships in the Philippines, but did have a force of cruisers. So cruisers were designed to be kept basically as a subsidiary force outside and also to be the eyes of the fleet. Destroyers, interestingly, were originally built to be torpedo boat destroyers, because when the torpedo was invented in the 1880s, what they decided to do was put them on little motorboats, and the little motorboats would sneak up on the battleships and fire torpedoes at them and sink them. So they needed ships that were capable of catching those little motorboats and destroying them. That's what the destroyer was actually built to be. But the destroyer actually turns into this jack of all trades. It's used for anti-submarine warfare. It's used for anti-aircraft defense. It can fire torpedoes, so it can fire at the main battle fleet. So the destroyer actually becomes probably the most versatile craft that was used during the war. And still to this day, destroyers are very, very versatile ships. The Arleigh Burke class comes to mind, those of you Navy guys. So hopefully that's a clarification of those. Yes, Bill? Will we hear about the old breed again? I maybe mention it when we get to Peleliu and I talk about Eugene B. Sledge.
Is there a pecking order if someone is a captain of a destroyer or a cruiser or a carrier or a battleship?
Well, let's put it like this. If you're going to be an admiral, okay, you're probably going to start out on a destroyer or a submarine and you're going to work your way up.
To carrier?
Well, today, yes. Back then, early in the war, it would have been battleship. Battleship was the key, theoretically. So, all right, I got to go. Thank you all.